we're going to process the acrylic palette on our maxillary thumb partial or flipper. So a couple of things that we want to do before we do that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up my acrylic, because I want my acrylic to set, or to start setting, while I'm doing the other preparation steps that I've got. I think it's this one. Okay, so just gonna get a little bit of acrylic here. Best to mix up just a bit more acrylic than you think you're going to need, because mixing up a bit less than you are going to need is always going to be a problem. I'm going to mix this repair acrylic so it's a nice, soft, smooth consistency. One of the few things I don't measure, because each amount that I'm going to mix is different. So, you know, I'm not going to mix a big measurement, a half a cup of this, if I'm only going to need a little bit. So, with your heat cure acrylic, when you do your your monomer powder ratio, you want to follow the instructions, and the mix that you come up with should be a fairly stiff and sandy mix. Something like this, where it's kind of crumbly, kind of grainy, and you think it's too dry, but then you mix it up and it wets and goes to a dough, and that's good. For a repair, I don't want it that thick. I find that if I have it that thick in a repair, that I just end up having difficulty with the acrylic when I'm doing the repair. I want this to be a nice, soft, smooth mix, like that. Okay, so it's a nice, creamy mix, and that's where I want to start with my acrylic. Okay, that's going to give me time to work with it. It's going to be a good consistency to work with, and everything should come out nicely with that. So I've separated the matrix. I'm going to clean my tooth. Oops, I just smacked the camera. Okay, so I'm going to just clean the ridge flap of the tooth here, the areas which are going to have acrylic on them. I just want to have clean acrylic in those areas. This has already been separated, so I can just put the tooth in. Now, because I brought the stone over the incisal a bit, I don't have to glue that tooth into place. A lot of people will glue the tooth into place. I'm going to outline where I want my partial to be, and I suggest you guys do this at this point. You're basically going to be doing the exercise you did in ortho, sprinkling your acrylic palette, except for a partial, we're going to score the model, which means that we're going to take an instrument and we're just going to put a shallow line all the way around where I've drawn that, where I've drawn the periphery of my acrylic. And this is called scoring. And what it's going to do is the acrylic is going to shrink, and it will just help to compensate for any shrinkage in the acrylic. I've done a little bit of wax block out on the proximal edges of the teeth on either side of the edentulous space. Don't have to, it just, I mean, for a case like this, there's not much of an undercut there. A lot of times I wouldn't bother, but I am demonstrating, so you know, I should try to do it right. I try not to take shortcuts here. Now I could, similar to ortho, I could use diluted separator for this. I just don't have any diluted handy. So I'm just putting on a coat of blowing off the excess. Notice I didn't do the separator until after I had scored the palette. So my acrylic now is just in this kind of creamy. I mean, it's got a bit of body, but not a huge amount of body. I've got what's called a dappen dish here, which is just a little container that I can use to put monomer in, and that's going to help me to move my acrylic around without the acrylic sticking to my instrument. Now, I want to do this repair when my acrylic is just a little doughy. I don't want it really rubbery for this part. And I suggest you guys don't wait too long for this, because then it goes off really quickly. So I'm just spreading the acrylic. What you don't want to do is start too early. We see students, they do this and they start too early, and then they have acrylic just running all over the place. So what I'm doing is I'm just forming my palette here. By the way, just an admission, I haven't done this. I can't remember the last time I did a denture, a partial like this. This isn't the technique that I prefer, but it's a good technique, and it's the one which is kind of accepted. So what I'm doing is simply building up a few millimeters of acrylic and forming it to the linguals of the teeth all around. And if you start when that acrylic is just starting its dough stage there, you can do a fair bit of smoothing and manipulating. The big thing is just trying to get the acrylic so it's in the place you want, and it's in about the thickness that you want. You don't want to have well, the two problems students have is either making it too thin. The more likely problem is starting with the acrylic too soft, and then the acrylic just runs all over the model. Now I'm going to put a little bit of monomer on my tooth. I've roughened the tooth already. You want the acrylic to be a little bit rubbery for this part where you're placing the tooth. So what I'm doing is I'm just putting the matrix into place and then pressing it to make sure that it sits on the model the way I made it. I don't want any crack around there. Okay, and our tooth is now sitting into the position that we originally made the tooth. So I'm just going to smooth the acrylic a little bit here. I'm a little bit thin, I think, on the lingual of this 5. Let's see if I can move a little bit of acrylic up there, because you usually end up with a fair bit on the midline here. So I've got a little on the midline I can move around. Notice that what I'm doing is wetting my spatula so that my spatula is going to be able to smooth the acrylic without sticking to the acrylic. Okay, so there's the basic shape of the partial. Now here's hoping this goes well. What I was taught to do is after you've formed everything and you've put the tooth on, I grab this matrix and I'm going to snap it off really quickly. Oh, it didn't quite work. Yeah, my acrylic was not quite set enough, but didn't work too badly, because I can push the tooth back into the position that it was in, and if I need, I can clean around the tooth. And I was taught to do this just to check that the tooth actually ended up where you want it. Now, as you notice there, as I said, I haven't done this for a while. I don't even know if I was on camera for that, but you know. So it's looking fairly reasonable. It's adapted to the teeth. Okay, so I'm now going to throw this in the pressure pot and then trim it. Basically, this is going to, as I said, it's going to trim up almost the same as your ortho palette here. And I'll probably do this in class on Friday because I don't have many of my trimming tools here. So, I'm just going to throw this in the pressure pot now the way you would at school. And there is your partial denture.